Wendy Elia, F. Scott Hess, and Marie-Anne Mancio, thank you so much for being here today. It's a pleasure to have you here. Today's session is called Stories, Symbolism and Seeing. In the last session, we looked at the division between form and content and talked about the generation of meaning linked to the formal elements of the manipulation of material. Today, we'll be looking at the content of representation on figurative work, especially related to its power to tell stories and the generation of meaning through suggested narratives. Stories in painting have a special quality thanks to their condensation in the picture plane and their stasis. Pictorial, literal tableaux are frozen in time and ask us to engage with a narrative in a way that's kind of different to the unfolding of written stories, which their very format exists in time, or at least they're read in time. Symbols are crucial to any form of narrative expression. And I'd like to briefly separate these into their constituent parts. Representational systems such as painting and literature include many elements in the construction of meaning that rest on the use of signs and symbols. The most immediate is the use of an iconic sign. An iconic sign is something that looks like or relates to the thing that it's actually referring to. A painted face or a hand can be iconic signs. What they refer to often rests on a direct relationship. A hand denotes a hand. But the complexity of narrative starts blossoming when we get into the symbolic, where meaning is suggested and connoted and includes elements of ambiguity. The gesturing hand, such as a clenched fist or a flying dove, are simultaneously signs and symbols. And suddenly we get into the role of interpretation. And consequently, it's crucial that the viewer or the reader actually engage with the work. They need to become interested in the work to give it the time that narratives and symbolism require for the imagery used to be given meaning. Some symbols will be more easily interpreted. Some will have personal significance for one person that isn't there for another. The act is never static. And the more time is given to responding to symbols, the more complex the meaning and the unfolding becomes. Today, it's wonderful to have with us Wendy Elia, F. Scott Hess, and Marie-Anne Mancio. Wendy Elia and F. Scott Hess are both fantastic painters who weave stories into their paintings through the use of layered symbolism. And Marie-Anne Mancio is an art historian, a theorist, and a writer of historical fiction. Both Wendy Elia and F. Scott Hess often weave symbols into their paintings that relate to their own personal history or the history of the people or the stories that they're painting. This element of self-awareness creates an understanding that the work before us is more than just a literal representation of a subject. The symbolic and self-aware elements open up a depth to be explored, a depth similar to that which takes place when a writer, and today we have here with us Marie-Anne Mancio, historicizes fiction or maybe fictionalizes history. When we recognize that self-aware element or those self-aware elements, we know we're facing an artifact that is asking us for our time to engage with it, to construct the meaning. And for me, what becomes hugely exciting in work that has such dense layering of meaning is similar to theories of consciousness that are based on complexity. Now, I know that those theories are hugely complex in themselves, and I'm just going to simplify and kind of borrow from that idea. But under the idea is the hypothesis that consciousness arises out of the synergy between so many already complex elements. So the overall effect is much larger than the sum of the parts. Now, I'm not trying to attribute consciousness to a painting, but engaging with a work where the meaning moves into the figurative realm rather than the literal opens itself up to the powerful effect of synergy. So once again, in synergy, the overall effect is much larger than the sum of the parts. And that's why, as some already know, I personally prefer to use the term figurative art, if these labels are going to be used at all, rather than representational, as embedded in the idea of figurative and figured meaning is a move away from the mimetic, or the mimetic understood as an act of copying. So with the synergy of representational elements, such as symbolism, we're thrown into the infinite sphere of metaphor and allegory. So on this suggestive note of metaphor and allegory, I'd like to turn to our speakers. And I'll start the conversation by asking each one a question, and we can then just see where the conversation takes us. So Wendy, I'm going to start with you. You often weave in the personal history of your sitters through emblems or symbols that become part of that layering of information in the image. How did that arise, the layering of different fragments, and how did it develop in your working process?
Well, just wanting to say slightly more than this is a portrait of someone, actually trying to give them some history. So, for example, in Made in Britain, where I've got all of these young people, this was made 10 years ago, all born in Britain, but from all different parts of the world, ethnically. For example, the little girl on the end is part Maori, so she wears this Maori symbol around her neck, and you'll find all of them wear some kind of bracelet or object that might relate to where their grandparents came from, perhaps. But it's also, I like the idea of things having wider meaning, and so you might be looking at a figure, but then maybe around the figure there are subtexts, there are things telling different stories. So I would suppose, I mean, it's been almost a subconscious thing. You know what you want the main narrative to be about, but then little things, the painting tends to make itself. Little things sneak in, and then I will use those things again and again in each painting.
And that's kind of links to the question that I had for Scott. Your complex and really dynamic narratives incorporate both external elements, kind of historical or from your own history or the world's history, and other symbols. And how has that evolved, and how does it relate to the multiple stories that a painting can embody?
First of all, Elina, thanks for doing these things. These are great, and I've been enjoying the first two, and now I get to participate as a speaker, so that's great. You know, I think of painting as being something that's going to be looked at for a long time. A lot of artists sort of dream of their paintings going into museums, and I've had a couple of those happen, you know, where it went directly from my studio into a museum, but for the most part, they go into somebody's house and they sit there for 20, 30, 40 years. And the idea, I think, for me of making a work more complex, at least for the viewer, is that they can continue to get something out of that for a long period of time. I'm not a big fan of, I guess, direct symbolism, you know, it gets a little bit confusing. So that idea of a rose, for example, as, you know, might mean something to a few people, love and passion in the Western culture, perhaps. But, you know, imagine a culture where they bring roses and cover dead people with them, you know, to cover the smell. That's going to give you a whole different feeling from that rose. So that idea that this one object has this meaning that is sort of solid, I don't really believe in. I kind of want to put my work together. The metaphor I'll use is one of DNA, where there's, you know, this long structure that has a lot of very small components in it, little switches, if you will, along that strand of DNA that add up to something that's very unique and very complex. So when I try to put a work together, the idea is to draw these things that are really just the components out of that we use in art, that, you know, through the history of painting, that have always been there: color and value and you know, perspective and space, the way abstract shapes interact. And then probably the most important things for me would be the body, facial expression. When we have figures in a painting, studies show that's where we go first. And where do we go first on the figure? We go to the face. So that facial expression becomes important. And then beyond that, with the figure, what the body is doing, and the gestures of the body and how those interact in multiple figure compositions become very important. There was a study a few years ago by David Friedberg and Vittorio Galeazzi, called Motion, Emotion, and Empathy in Aesthetic Response. This came out in 2007. And I thought that was probably the most important thing I've read in several decades in terms of art history, just that it brought in the importance of our mirror neurons and how our bodies interact when we see other bodies in action, and how that can add up to, in a painting, an aesthetic response. So when I'm putting together, all of these things, all of these little components, I get to a point, all those things I just mentioned with, all the things that we use in painting, color and value and space and all this, and gesture. I want to grab you within 2 seconds of looking at my piece and sort of take your soul. And I figure once I've got you, grabbed you, then I can start, you're sort of sucked in, I've got you. Then I can start adding the other elements that are important in getting maybe a more thematic content across, which might be art historical referencing, that pieces are elements in my composition relate to something that's in art history already. And that not only kidnaps what was in art history, but the way I change it adds a whole other layer of meaning in there too. And then beyond that, the psychological level that's at work, what's happening between the figures in my compositions, how are they relating to the objects around them, and to these other people, becomes this huge element in putting these together. There's always a personal level of content. In everything I do, I sort of look at my art throughout all these years as building a sort of mythologizing my life and relating it to myths of the society at large. I think I'm an atheist. So for me, the job of an artist is to create meaning in a meaningless universe. If I was a believer in God, then I would say my job is to, create meaning for a religion or create meaning for politicians, whatever, depending on your viewpoint. But in my case, it's kind of, creating meaning in life. And so that's, on a personal level, that's what I think most of my work does. There's also then that connection from the personal level to social political ideas, sort of a broader thing. I talked about, the myths of a society and connecting to those. So I want somewhere in that work that there's this broader context to come in. And finally, I think most of my work also relates to me as an artist and what that is. I think in the painting that you used in the ad for this talk, Dancing at the Edge of Time, it's my wife and I spinning through our house and all of our possessions around us. But I'm barefoot, and that barefoot figure I've used in a number of paintings as, the artist out in the world, vulnerable, but still journeying somewhere.
That's really interesting because it crosses over with the idea as well that there are symbols that become kind of the personal mythology of the painter. Like Wendy said that she has symbols that come up, and I don't know if that's also the case with you, Marie-Anne. The question that I had with you, Marie-Anne, is there are so many things that I could ask you about because of the fact that you are an art historian, theorist, but also you write historical fiction. So I guess that I wanted to ask you maybe to start off with this idea about the balance between history and fiction in the novels that you write, and maybe later we can come back to this idea that's already come up a number of times of slow looking that we talked about, and the idea of symbols unpacking over time that also Scott and Wendy have talked about. But for now, maybe you could talk about the balance of the historical and the fictional in your own work.
I think there are some interesting crossovers already with what people have said, and particularly this idea of using the past to shed light on the present. So this is something that's very important to what I write. So in horticulture, for instance, it was a way of exploring a quite explosive topic of sex work, but doing it through a particular period in time, which was the gold rush of 1848 in San Francisco. And in terms of the balance of fiction and history, for me as an art historian, particularly lately when I've been, I'm writing at the moment a novel about Caravaggio. So you don't want to invent where you're diverting from something that actually happened. But on the other hand, there are so many gaps in our knowledge that you can use those and you can fill those with fiction. But you have to be truthful, I think, to the history, so that there's nothing worse than somebody, I get this a lot when I teach, that somebody has seen the film A Girl with a Pearl Earring, and therefore all their knowledge about Vermeer comes from a piece of fiction. You have to be able to know, tell the difference, if you like. But going back to what you were saying about symbols, the thing that really interested me in horticulture was the 19th century flower dictionaries, because people used to use these flower dictionaries to create these bouquets of flowers, and each flower had a meaning, and when you combine the flowers they had a different meaning again, and they would use them to send messages to lovers or to people they didn't like. You could reject someone with a bunch of orange lilies, for instance. And what fascinated me is that actually there were several flower dictionaries, and they didn't all attribute the same meanings to each flower. So if you're not reading from the same dictionary, you could very easily misinterpret this bouquet that you just sent or just received. So there's lots of things like that, where symbols, as you say, obviously are not universal, they're not ahistorical, they change over time. And as someone who has to teach this, in a sense, when we're looking at paintings in art history, it's always one of the things that fascinates people who are new to art history. They want to understand, they want you to unlock this language of symbols. So I find it really satisfying, and also linking to Wendy's work a little bit here, because she haven't mentioned, but I've also modeled for Wendy. So I've had the experience of having a portrait done. And one thing she was really brilliant at is this collaboration with the sitter. So she's not the kind of artist that just says, sit here, you're like a piece of flesh, I'm moving your hand here. It's very much a collaboration. And so some of the symbols that ended up in that work were things that I had brought accidentally. I remember, I think I had a plaster on my foot from when my high heels had been rubbing, and she was like, okay, yeah, keep it in, this is your foot at the moment. It is on the one hand you've got this lovely high heel, on the other hand you've got this scabby toe with your plaster on. So things like that then became very personal to the sitter, but could be added another layer of meaning for the viewer, I think.
So I know that Wendy, you've got some, and I think that kind of it came up a little bit with Scott as well, but Wendy, you've got some recurrent symbols, and I can see one of them actually sitting behind you.
Yeah, I've got one which is a rubber bullet canister, and a rubber bullet, which was invented by the British in the 1970s to deal with the Northern Ireland troubles. And they shot these at people, and the company, well, it was developed by the British Army, and the company's called Round a Riot. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? And so if you Google Round a Riot, it'll come up. It's in the Imperial War Museum, and you'll see one of these bullets. I think they stopped using them in '89 after they flogged them to the rest of the world. Which now use these as crowd control in various forms. They're probably more plastic than rubber now. So this item's very often in most paintings. So, and it's there as a sort of almost personal symbol, I suppose, for the power of the state, because no matter what we do, the state seems to be hovering behind us, and beware. Because, they will get you. Now, this might be my paranoia, but, in my life, I have been exposed to the power of the state. And so, I quite like putting this thing in that people think, well, what's that there for? What does it mean? And then I don't know whether anyone would bother because you can see the fact that it says Round a Riot to Google that, because then they would come up with the story of that. And then, yes, there's the ibis. So, whoops. So when I first started using that, I just liked it as an object, this brass ibis. I didn't even know it was an ibis. which has so many connotations, you know, from Egypt across the world. What does this bird mean? But to me at the time, it was this bird on a plinth, almost a bit like the goldfinch, chained to its perch, and the bird on the plinth, which kind of represents me, I think, as a mother and a female artist, and the struggles that that I've had to sort of keep producing work. And so that tends to slip into lots of paintings. So now I'm not expecting people, though people do want to know what exactly does this mean. I'm hoping, as Scott was saying, that people will respond to these things almost physically, you know, as you would to the words of the poem, that you will actually respond, it'd be nice in a sort of more visceral way, as you would to music, to these things, and allow yourself to have your own feelings about what they might mean to you, I suppose. I don't know, maybe not.
Well, I think that maybe that idea of ambiguity is at the heart of it. For all of us that use symbols in our work, the ambiguity is necessary. And Scott, you've often kind of mentioned that and talked about the need for these symbols to exist, but not necessarily be closed stories.
Yeah, I think, well, I've got mixed feelings about it. I want to control the viewer's mind, you know, but I don't want to give them an endpoint at my narrative. You know, I want to take them down a path that's very controlled. And, you know, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what these things, how these things are going to work on people's minds. And so I want you to be thinking down a certain pathway. And, you know, I'm employing, you know, color and lighting and body language, all that stuff to get you to think that way. And then putting in little symbols about different elements, different layers of meaning, if you will. But at the end, I'm not going to give you a satisfying answer. I had a guy get really angry at me at one exhibition because I wouldn't tell him what a painting meant. And I said, you can decide yourself. And he was furious. But I think when a painting is figured out, you know, when you know what a painting's about, it's over, it's dead, you know, it's gone. I want it to be open-ended, and I want it to be maybe even have contrasting meanings. I really get excited when I'm doing a painting and I start putting something in and, oh, this is exactly the opposite of what I intended. But it means that there are these two conflicting views now in my painting, and they could be, you know, completely at odds. The painting right behind me has this minotaur farting, you know, and there's these animals behind it that are kind of laughing. It was about me getting older. That was the basic idea. And at some point in the middle of it, I realized this is Donald Trump, you know, with his orange hair. The bull has orange hair. And you know, these two things are, as far as I'm concerned, totally at odds. You know, me and Donald Trump, I don't want to be in the same painting with him, but there it was. And I kind of thought, well, this is kind of cool. But, you know, that's the nice thing about painting. It can hold these different contrasts. Everything's available to you constantly at the same time. And it can hold totally different meanings. And still work as a wonderful painting. So it's not like a movie or a play or even literature where it has to kind of make linear sense and you come to an end point and everything, you know, your happy Hollywood ending, everything's fine. You can't quite do the same thing, or shouldn't, I think, do the same thing in a painting. You want to leave it a little more open to interpretation at the end. So
the kind of, Marie-Anne, does that link between how much ambiguity and how much polysemy and mixed meaning and sometimes contradictory meaning you can have in a piece of work, given your experience both with literature and painting, how do you see the relationship between the two? Are they very different? Do you think they overlap sometimes?
I think I would agree that definitely painting is generally more open-ended, or painting I enjoy is more open-ended. I love non-linear narratives when I'm reading, etc. And when you're writing, yes, you try to, you know, have as layers and sublayers and subtext and so forth. But generally, if you look at the majority of fiction, that's mainstream fiction that's published, there is a structure, there is a linear structure, there are key protagonists, there's an arc, there's all of these things that are embedded in a sense in the way that the majority of novels published expect from a writer. And they don't like open-ended novels in the same way. People don't. They need to feel they've been on, I hate the word, but on a journey with this character, and that they're going to start and end in a different place. Whereas I think you're right, with a painting, there is usually, well, if it's a good painting, there's more room, I think, for many layers. But then if you think about, that's also a sophisticated audience that we're talking about, because we're expecting our painting to work on those layers. We're taking it for granted, for instance, that if you put in art historical references, well, they're only legible to someone who understands art history. If you don't know anything of art history, that clever little reference to Picasso goes by the wayside. I know Wendy puts in loads of wonderful, it's like a test your art history, because you'll have an El Greco or Rubens in the background, and some people can identify them and some can't. So it can't rely on those for meaning, I think. Otherwise,
and Scott, I think Scott does very much the same thing as well. I'm kind of interested in how much does it matter if some stuff is lost, because I think that sometimes that layering and that complexity means that you can miss one, you can get one, you can miss another one, but what's important is that there's an overall feeling to it. I don't know what you all think about it.
It's a bit like the postmodernist, postmodernist architecture, isn't it? And people like Charles Jenks talking about double coding, that there's a layer that it was supposedly non-elitist, a layer that everybody could get, and then the kind of layer for those, the in-joke for the architects. And it probably doesn't matter, but it is also nice to give people a way into a work, isn't it? I feel, because this is what I try to do when I'm teaching, to teach in a way that's accessible. There was a big thread today on Twitter about the new sculpture on the fourth plinth, and just reading the thread of comments, and you can see that the thing that bothers people is when they can't get hooked into this work, they don't understand it, so they write it off because they dislike it, because it's contemporary, because they don't get it, because they don't see where it's come from. They don't know the history of art, so they can't see what it's reacting to, etc. So I think I know in some of Wendy's works, for instance, sorry, I'm talking more about her work because I know it very well, but you'll use a title that references the title of a painting. I'm thinking like the Poussin, the Dance to the Music of Time. So if someone Googled the Dance to the Music of Time, they would then immediately get that reference, and that's quite nice, I think, as well, as a way in. There are things you can do.
I think it's always quite wonderful when somebody does understand your work. Occasionally a critic will write about something and they nail it, and that's kind of surprising, because it usually doesn't happen. But it's also wonderful when you're talking to viewers and they've completely gone off on some other tangent that you didn't have in mind, and they've come up with these wonderful ideas on their own. You didn't put it in the painting, but it's kind of wonderful when that happens, that you're sending their brain to this other space. It's great. So, I don't think it's bad when stuff gets missed. I put in so much in there that I expect most of it's going to be missed. That's just the way it is. I'm putting it in there probably for me as much as anything else. But I do want to communicate ideas, and people that spend time with it, somebody that owns it and has it in their house, spends a lot of time with the painting, is hopefully going to catch some of those things day after day, year after year, as they're looking at that painting. It's not something that should reveal itself quickly at all.
I think that's what we were talking about, wasn't it, as well, with Elina, this idea that people need to look more slowly and take their time with work. I guess it's the same with fiction. When you think how long it takes to write a novel, and you could just read it in 2 or 3 days if you were reading straight, and so many people look at a painting and that you've maybe spent months over, and they'll look at it for 5 minutes, 3 minutes actually, I think is the average. So yeah, we are not very good at taking time to look, and because it's not time-based like a book, it doesn't, you know, it's great when it's so full of things that people then want to, as you say, look at it more deeply, more closely, and come back to it as well.
There is a dilemma, though, isn't there? Because I've been educated in the Western canon, and so therefore a lot of my symbols signifiers are very Western, and that's problematic, and it's a dilemma. And I've been really trying to think of what is more global, what is the more global symbol, what is the more universal sign. I mean, you know, and also a lot of these things, just like the saints and their attributes, are going to end up like Egyptian hieroglyphs, aren't they? No one's going to understand them at some point. I mean, I'm assuming that Christianity will die out. It probably won't, but I do. It's a bit of a dilemma, isn't it? Because then there's only one group that is probably understanding all those references. So how do you make a more universal set of symbols? I mean, I think that is the problem I set myself, I suppose, to a certain extent.
I think there's a lovely story. I think it was James Bradburn at the Brera in Milan, and he was showing around a group of Chinese artists. And of course, they just didn't have the same, as Wendy was saying, the same understanding and language of these symbols. It didn't mean anything to them. So as he was showing them one Madonna and child after another, one of these artists said to him, well, who's the nanny? You know, that's how they interpret it, that this must be the nanny of this baby. And that was fascinating, because you just think, oh my, you know, it shows how much we take for granted when we look at something like that. To us, it's so recognizable, but to another culture, completely reading it differently. And I'm not sure that you can make a universal symbol, that we should be trying to.
I really agree with that. And I think that the kind of Joseph Campbell attempts at totalizing mythology and putting everything underneath one camp is really problematic, because of course, as human beings, there are certain elements that reappear. For example, the fundamental hardwiring of 6 expressions into our facial responses to pain and fright. And there are certain things that obviously may have some form of universality as Homo sapiens, but then there is so much that's culturally specific. And I think it's really important to remember, because there are a lot of people who do kind of strive solely for the universal. And although I think you can maybe move away from the very specific, there will always be that kind of specificity. And I often think, going back to the idea of the roses or the orange tulips that has come up, just to carry on the kind of isotopy and the metaphors of flowers, I always think, what's going to happen? Because roses, have always been associated with very beautiful flowers, but they have their spines, the little spikes that make us bleed. Now, a lot of roses are actually genetically modified to not have spines and spikes. And so what's that going to be? All of this kind of poetry of romanticism is suddenly going to be, why is the rose so important? If the rose is actually quite harmless, it doesn't have that element. And so even something that seems so universal, like Wendy said, in the end is going to become something that was a symbol that is just within its kind of structure that then doesn't get read. At the same time, I love this idea of the kind of depth of layering, that even if you don't understand the symbol, there's often that intentionality to create the kind of strata of information that grabs someone's attention. And it's that makes people spend time over work and try and fathom what's going on. And you might be completely off the mark and get it completely wrong, but actually, does it matter?
As artists, we've all learned to let go of it, because very often we are misinterpreted, I think. But that doesn't stop me from wanting to communicate certain things. You know, in talking about universals, I think that there are certain things that all people, you know, that are embedded in our bodies, embedded in our brains, embedded in our existence on this planet, that we can relate to. And I was talking about that metaphor of my narrative constructions being a bit like a DNA strand. And my idea with those is to string things together. You know, when I taught color it was the idea that red, for example, meant something was pointless. You know, that this idea red is for blood or love or passion or whatever is kind of pointless, but specific shades of red tend to evoke more specific feelings in people. And then when you take that together with other color combinations, our relationship to those color combinations can be much more specific. Designers know this. You know, they put together websites and have specific colors in there that are supposed to affect us a certain way. People that design corporate logos do the same thing, where, you know, we're supposed to react subconsciously to this thing. Painters should, you know, I think be a little more aware of that than they generally are. But you start stringing color together and value and how value relates to the brain. You know, most of our brain isn't working in color; it's working in black and white, putting things in space in black and white, and movement we see in black and white. So, you know, we're very good with value structure. So, you know, that can mean something, light and dark and contrast and how that works in space. Anyway, you start to string all these things together, and I think you get to something that is pretty specific by the end of that, you know, that strand. And then, you know, you grab people at this visceral level with those things that anybody in the world probably understands. And you get them at a point that's pre-verbal, where they're not thinking these things out yet. Then you can start, once you, like I say, you hook them, then you can start to add these other layers that might be a little more culturally specific. But in a way, you've already delivered the punch of your painting through these very simple elements that are strung together in a complex way.
I kind of, to throw it back into the kind of the personal, the socio-political. One of the things that I really loved about the Wendy, you had the Made in Britain painting, but even some of the other paintings, you reuse kind of the surveillance camera.
Well, security cameras. I mean, I've been painting since the 80s, you know. So, I mean, and that they were around then, and I was putting them in my paintings then. So there's always, so it is the sort of big brother things always watching you. You know, I'm an urban creature. I was born, raised in London. You know, I'm very urban, and so, you know, I think London is one of the most watched places in the world, isn't it? In terms of cameras and things. I think England is actually. So yes. So the security camera is always pointing outwards, and there's always one pointing, looking at you as well. So it's just that whole surveillance thing, which of course now is, you know, everyone's so aware of it. But I've always been very aware of it and quite concerned about it. Somehow, you know, you sort of, you know, even when you're sort of lying in bed with the curtains wide open and you're thinking, is there some satellite up there zooming in? Of course, we know they can't really do that quite yet, but you know, it's that feeling of being watched. And then of course, you know, who else are we being watched by, etc. Yeah.
And then there's often in your paintings, there's that kind of, because there's a very clear awareness of the viewer looking at the painting, photographs in the background being looked at, and there's this kind of, the idea of representation recurs quite a lot. So an extra kind of viewing eye is kind of a natural, it fits in with all of this idea of viewing and seeing and looking.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's, the thing is, I've only just recently started turning the sitter's gaze away from the viewer, whereas previously every single painting the viewer has to confront, or the sitter is confronting the viewer, if you like. So it's an uncomfortable relationship, you know. Portraits where the eyes are looking at you don't sell as well as portraits where the eyes are looking down, etc., which is interesting. And it's only very recently I've kind of shifted and I'm turning the gaze away. Well, we'll see what happens there. But it is this idea of, as you are watching them, they're also watching you. So it's more of a communication with them rather than you just being the voyeur. And I know people have said it does make them uncomfortable.
And in a sense, that links back to the idea of this idea of the pre-verbal and how you can connect with something that connects us all, that actually we look for where people are looking, we look at whether people are kind of friendly or they're going to be aggressive towards us, we read body language, faces, and all of that information. And so having that kind of gaze, immovable gaze looking straight at you, is something that will kind of trigger a response in people.
I'd still argue it doesn't come out of a universal language though, because I think in Wendy's case definitely it's very much about turning around the usual position of the model, the female model who is there to be looked at. So it comes out of a very political engagement with the idea of the model as someone who's going to look back and confront your voyeurism. That's what most of those works, I think, are about. So this is why we struggle, I think, with this notion of universal, because what does it actually mean? We're all human, but we have such different experiences.
I guess it depends on what you consider universal. I would never think that anything I put in a painting is going to be understood by everybody. But I do want sometimes to be communicating certain things in that painting to most people, you know, and I wouldn't want it to just be a Western audience that it communicates with. So I do kind of search out things that are going to be broader at the same time that I will later put in things you have to think about that are probably a little more Western oriented, you know, my own culture. But that's, you know, I don't want it. I don't want those paintings to just operate on that level, that it's just something that people who are like me are going to understand. I want to be able to grab people, you know, from across the planet with the images that I'm producing. And so I think that there's enough in most of the paintings I make to do that. And so it must connect somehow. It's not a universal because you're not going to get everybody, but it's going to connect to a lot of people. And, you know, I think that's as good as you get.
It's quite interesting to have these hybrids, you know, this use, whether you can use a symbol that works in a hybrid way.
Kind of appropriation, isn't there? You know,
there's
appropriating other people's cultures, and you know, and so you have to be so careful. It's a minefield. In an ideal world, we could borrow, appropriate, share, but you have to be very careful, I think, because it can offend people.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Are you happy to take a quick break? What I want to do now is open it up to your questions.
Thank you, Elina. In the beginning, you said this: symbols are crucial. And then I wrote down, and I need you to finish this. An iconic sign refers to what?
So an iconic sign in the theory of kind of semiotics is something that looks a little bit like what it's talking about. So an iconic sign could even be a smiley. So emoticons tend to be quite iconic signs because there's a relationship between what they're representing. And then the idea of symbols being crucial, it came up in our room that there are a lot of artists who don't work with symbols. So in a sense, they're crucial to the discussion we're having today about creating narratives and layered meaning through symbols. But obviously for someone who's working abstractly, there may be some form of symbolic resonance through what a color means culturally or any other elements, but it might not be crucial. So I might take back the idea of saying crucial if that's what I said. I think we should always have the possibility of rectifying and changing our minds.
It seems when a painting has a person in it where the person is making eye contact with the viewer, it really changes the meaning of the painting. And I'm just wondering what you guys think of this in terms of maybe universality or narrative.
Well, it is that direct communication, isn't it? Because you're looking at them and they're looking at you straight back. So, you know, there is, you know, you are communicating with them rather than just looking at them as if through a window, you know, that typical Renaissance looking through a window. So, yeah. And as I said, you know, sometimes people do find that a bit too confrontational.
You know, anything the face is doing is something we're really aware of, and looking at you or not looking at you obviously carries content. It's a more direct, aggressive thing to be looking at somebody than to be looking away. And this is, but I think that the way facial expression works is pretty amazing. There's a book, The Biology of Seeing, Livingston is her name. And she has a little bit in there about why the Mona Lisa works. And it's fascinating. It may be true, it may not. But it is that the difference between detailed vision and peripheral vision when we're looking at that face. And we see in detailed vision, we see a little bit of a smile. And then when we look away, our peripheral vision, say we're looking at the landscape behind Mona Lisa, peripheral vision picks up on the musculature of the face that is painted in there. And it's a much bigger smile. And then we look back at the face in detailed and it's small again. And so Mona Lisa ends up flirting with us because it's one thing one way and you look away and she smiles bigger and you look back and she's not. That's really human, first of all. But it also shows how much connection we have as human beings to facial expression and how much we can read, not only looking directly at a face, but even away from it. Just in the musculature of the face, you know, we've got huge portions of our brain set aside to deal with other humans, and their facial expressions are really a huge part of that. So,
it's a fascinating book because it breaks down vision. So I really recommend it to everyone because it also focuses on the idea of the different cells that we have and the color vision and the black and white vision that we have. So as painters, those fundamental building blocks we have for composition and creating focal points. And there's a very exciting example with Monet of like things being there and not being there.
What happens to authorial intent when it's compromised by the dynamic of power within commission work?
Yeah, I'm engaged in a really big commission right now. It's been 2 years. It'll be 2 more years. 2 pods in a Kansas City synagogue, or the synagogue building, and it's altogether 208 feet of painting that are 64 inches tall and hundreds of figures. So I'm about half done, almost half done at this point. I certainly went into the project thinking that I would be creating, you know, the Sistine Chapel.
Right.
That was kind of I thought I would have that freedom. And I presented something which was rejected basically by the guy who was paying for it all, right? And he, you know, presented something that had, let's say, I don't think it hung together anywhere near as well as what I had done. But I had to work within that realm then. And I found eventually that I had space to do that I could articulate certain things that were important to me that are different than what are important to him. And I could do that within these paintings. We talked earlier, a painting can have many meanings. And so, you know, these paintings can have meanings for me and they can have meanings for him. And he's completely satisfied with what he's getting, as is the congregation. And I have, you know, my own ideas are in there. Some of them personal, some of them social, political. But there's other things that come into it that make me able to claim some authorship in there. Am I as happy with them as I would be making a painting totally for my own drive? No, you know, I don't think and I also know what the possibilities were. I'm the only person in the world really who knows what the possibilities were of my first design, and what that could have been and what it's not. So, you know, you come to grips with that slowly.
I think Michelangelo would have had the same response.
what's the ultimate goal for your work? What do you see as your ultimate goal? Like when you look back at the end of your life and look at everything you've produced, what is it that you want to hold on to? What is it that you're trying to build and construct that you leave behind? What would leave you satisfied?
I would say I want to live forever. So I know these paintings are going to outlast me, at least most of them. So I want them to be around to speak my voice when I am gone.
I just want to paint one good painting. You know, I think what moves me from one painting to the next is just wanting to paint that really good painting, that one that's going to be my Guernica.
Yeah, and I think I'm very interested in leaving behind some characters in fiction that I feel have not been represented particularly well in fiction. So everything I write ends up having some form of sex worker in it. And in my Caravaggio book, I'm interested in looking at the models, actually, the women that were modeling for him that we know so little about, and kind of bringing them to the fore as characters.
I'd love to just trigger thought, my own learning. And if at the end of my life I've learned every single day something new from all of you and helped other people kind of enter into conversation, then that's exciting, be it through painting or through these kind of contexts.
This relates to Marie-Anne's question we brought up in our group about surveillance cameras. My husband says to me all the time that I am a human surveillance camera, because I walk around taking pictures of people all the time when they're unaware. And then I put them in the background of my paintings. So what do you think about the ethics of that?
Well, you see, as a writer, we can do that, can't we? I do that all the time. You're looking at people and you're borrowing things and you're writing it down, but obviously it's not quite the same as photographing them, but it's what we're doing. So ethically, it's the same. I don't know. I think we're all, as Wendy says, we're all being surveyed in one form or another. So why not you do it rather than a government camera?
But I think it's great if you're brave enough to go and do it. The only thing is, you know, you're supposed to get written permission, aren't you? So you only hope that they're not going to recognize themselves. You have to be like a sponge. I'm like a sponge. You know, and I will grab imagery from the TV, from everywhere, you know. I would just, and then I don't use most of it. I've got files and files and files. I mean, you know, look at all those files up there of images I don't use, that I think I'm going to use, and I save it.
In general, in terms of the ethics of it, I think if you're taking anything that's in public and you're changing it anyway in a painting, it's fine. You know, I mean, I think anybody who goes outside is fair game.
It's interesting, legislatively, it depends on the country as well. I think if you're in a public space, you're allowed to. If you're not in a public space, you're not actually allowed to. But it will depend if you're in a museum or if you're in the street. It's different legislation kind of covers people's privacy.
Just had a question in regards to just finding inspiration for symbols and just keeping it consistent, because I've been trying to get more into a narrative side of things, but I get stuck in a rut. So I don't know what paths I could take in terms of finding symbols and weaving narratives out of them. Like, how do I weave a story? How do I weave a narrative and find symbols that mean something to me, you know? So I just want some ideas as to where I can get started with that and try to keep it consistent.
Well, it depends what you want to say. You know, is it something particular you want to say with a piece of work? I mean, I think even those personal things around you, you know, I don't know whether you have little ornaments or anything, you know. I mean, a pair of trainers can be a symbol, can't it? Yeah, I would just start with the things around you. You know, how can you weave a story out of that? The objects that are around you, perhaps.
Or start with the story is the other thing so many artists have done, haven't they? Starting with an existing, like the work, Wendy's, you're looking at now, aren't we? Just inspired by some paintings by Artemisia Gentileschi, who's using these old kind of biblical narratives, etc. But just as a starting point, and then thinking of how you could translate that into a contemporary story, and what symbols would you use to replace those symbols which really, you know, don't mean so much to us anymore.
Well, I've always thought life provides its metaphors for you. So I think the things that are around you, no matter how simple, are also sort of loaded, and that you can take those. I think Wendy was getting at that too, that, you know, those are the things that are important, you know, the things that you're relating to. Look at those. What do they mean? What, you know, what's the deeper meaning of this stuff that you're interacting with all the time? The people, and, you know, the clothing you're wearing, and the stuff you have around the house. All of that ends up in my paintings. And just in the act of painting it, somehow they get a more metaphorical meaning, I guess, if you will. They become more important. I think, you know, beyond that, in terms of, you know, getting inspiration, finding other things, art history is a great place to look. Look at how other artists used some of the similar things that you're looking at in your own life. You know, how did that turn out in that Caravaggio painting? You know, that vase over on the side, you know, something like that. Just sort of building the echoes of whatever the things are that are around you in your life through art history, through literature, through you know, other means, to help build out the depth and the importance of those things that are in your own life.
I think when you used to do an exercise, didn't you, that if you had to create a portrait of yourself, a self-portrait, sorry, but only using objects, which objects would you use? You know, this kind of thing. How would you, if you were taking the figure out of it, how would you represent yourself purely through objects?
Could I ask a question of a moderator, of you? Because
Yes.
I've been looking at the work which you've got behind you, and quite like it. But I want to what my responses would be that it is amusing. Now, would you say that is a shallow response or a wrong response?
I don't think there is a wrong response in any response to painting. If someone has a response, then it exists. I think it depends the context in which you see things, the scale. When you actually see this piece of work, which is life-size, it breaks down into quite a lot of mark making and engagement with the surface. So I think it becomes less about the impact of the image. I think that amusing is a really valid response. I'd like to think that the experience of the work, if you actually see it in the pigment, is more than just amusing. If it's not, that's my shortcoming. So that's something that you can't then actually kind of gauge how people are going to respond to things. But again, this exists with other pieces of work. And someone who was in my room was talking about the fact that it starts speaking about the space around it. And it's nice to see that different people have different responses to one piece of work. And again, that's where symbolism and the way in which you choose what you paint is going to be interpreted by different people in different ways. So no, by all means, have a great laugh. I think laughter is underrated. But I think that there's seriousness as well to be unpicked there.
I want to go a little deeper into the question of commission work. And has it started feeling like a torture yet, Scott?
Not a torture. There's days when I'm pretty tired of it, and other days when I bang through it pretty fast. I mean, you know, if anybody's been following it on Facebook, I have covered all but about 12 feet of the first 104 feet. So it's, and I don't know how many hundreds of figures are already in there. And it's hard, but you know, I'm used to sitting in a studio painting. That's what I've done most of my life. So yeah, it's difficult work. I spend anywhere from 8 to 10 hours a day in there doing it. But I'm sure at the end, you know, these things hang 8 feet off the ground in a room under a dome with a arched window above each one. Each wall is 26 feet long. And once they're all up, it's going to look impressive.
When you were talking about universality, and in a way, universality is the way to connect to the viewer or the reader. Also, isn't it the artist's job to step aside and present something from a different perspective for other people to enjoy?
I'm talking about using things that are universal to express things that are coming out of my head, that are unique to me, I think. And you want to communicate. It's not, if I just did stuff that was interesting to me and nobody else, then what's the point? There's no communication going on. I'm not delivering anything to anyone else. So I definitely want to deliver, what's in my head to your head. And to do that, I have to find some sort of commonality between what's in my head and what's in yours. And to get that linked, to make that link happen to as many people as possible, I want to find symbols that will connect with all those people. But it's still my voice that is using those, lining up those ducks, so to speak, that are universal, that hopefully will connect to a greater number of people. Like I say, you don't get everybody, but if I can get a fair number of people, I'm going to be pretty happy with that.
Yeah, I think you need the audience, don't you? Because I think a lot of people don't really have much to say, and they're desperately trying to find something to say. Whereas I have so much to say, it causes me so much stress and sleepless nights. And I think the important thing is that if you probably what drives you on is the fact that you have something to say. And that's what will drive you. So yeah, it is about communication, and you do want as many people as possible to see your work. Otherwise, it does seem a bit pointless.
I want to question the premise of universality as a virtue in art. We take that somewhat for granted, but that's somewhat of a Western construct. In non-Western societies, often meaning is exclusive and esoteric deliberately. How much is universality to be taken for granted, and when is there a sort of private iconography for the initiate, and when is art not necessarily for everybody on purpose?
And that's a really interesting question, because also languages tend to have an element of exclusivity, and it's an interesting overlap between the idea that often ritual has an element of initiation, and often ritual also has a link to artifacts. And so how do those artifacts exist when they are specifically designed to be in a context where initiation is a kind of integral part of the engagement with that artifact or its context?
In our breakout group, we were talking about being offended. So it's interesting that this is another side of the coin of what Joseph brings up about what's virtuous and then what's offensive, and who's privileged or entitled or offended to see it.
The extreme end of that is that whole business, the Buddhas being destroyed and temples being destroyed. The complete non-universality. I mean, maybe I should use the word inclusive, but that's the end result of the complete opposite of being intolerant to other people's art, if we want to call religious icons art, which of course most art throughout the centuries has been it's been made through religion one way or other.
If I may jump in and offer like few opinions why universalism might be important for some people and where the tradition comes from. If you think about religious tradition, it's in Christianity, it's in Buddhism as well, proselytizing religious views and converting to particular religious system. It's a part of many religious traditions that have art as a vehicle, actually. So I don't know about examples where Buddhist art has excluded non-Buddhist viewers. There might be cases, yeah, but I think that especially those religious traditions that are open to outsiders, they have that kind of like attempt to make universal claims and work with symbols that are accessible to others.
Let me address, if you will, an example of Buddhist art being esoteric to the point of non-accessible. I had a little, when I was a curator, I had a little Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist sculpture of the 15th Dalai Lama. And eventually I had an opportunity to share it with the Punjan Lama. And he was overwhelmed when he discovered that we had access to this piece, because they thought it had been lost. And it had existed for several hundred years, hidden in a temple, but not just hidden at the temple, but concealed within the temple, within a column capital. And its function was totemic and metaphysical. It wasn't so much to be seen, but to exist in that space, to sanctify that space. Here was an example where for a period the work was secret, not even visible to Buddhists, not even visible to the initiates of the temple, but they knew it existed and knew it was there. And so it was a sanctifying image that was non-visible. But then it had transitioned at some point in its history to where even its metaphysical function had changed, and now it had become visible and was existing outside its original context to become universal. So it had gone from invisible and esoteric to universal and extrinsic. It was also so beautiful. It wasn't just a totemic object.
That raises the question of the functionality of art in general. When you move away from certain circles, for example, figurative painting circles or other circles, or maybe circles that still embrace the idea of modernism, the idea of even using the word function with art is like blasphemy. And that for me opens so many questions about, even for some people, it's very uncomfortable to talk about narrative in art. And that actually the idea that you instrumentalize art for the sake of narrative is problematic. And I'm just throwing those out there as ideas about how values change over time. And for me, it's absolutely fundamental that we are aware that and it came up in our group, but letting go of this idea of looking for absolute answers and realizing that answers are never absolute. And that happens in all cultural and artistic domains, but really in all socio-political domains, all human domains, nothing is ever absolute. It needs constant renegotiation.
I think the writer Ellen Dissanayake has written about, she wrote a book, I think it's called What is Art For? And it's an interesting question, because I think most painters that I know never think about that. You know, why do we make art to begin with? It's kind of a weird thing. You know, smearing mud on a panel and people are looking at it and relating to it as if it's something real. This is kind of fascinating, but why are we making it? Her answer was that art makes things special. And that wasn't quite satisfying to me. But the way she writes about it is very interesting, raises a lot of questions. I decided for me that art gives, makes things meaningful, basically. That's the purpose of it, that it gives meaning to our lives. But getting back to Joseph's question about universality, I think you're kind of looking at these works as they come into the world and expecting them to be universal. And I'm looking at ways to connect to people universally, I guess, which I also agree is not possible. But as I stated, I just want to hit as many people as I can. I want it to connect to as many people as possible. My works are not meant to be secret and sitting on top of a column somewhere hidden in a temple. I want them to communicate to as many people as possible, I guess. When I was younger, I did do erotic art, and I didn't start painting until I was 30. And so all the work I did from the age of 7 until through college was erotic. And I still wanted it to be seen, I wanted to put it out there. But as you were sort of alluding to, Joseph, a lot of other people didn't want to see it. It caused some trouble. And so, I was always furious. Why don't people want to see this? Well, it's because I was trying to disturb them and was succeeding. So, that's kind of a different path of things, I guess, than what I was talking about before.
As somebody who's had to run a museum, I had to forever negotiate that. In one sense, personally, I'm not inclined to censorship. But at the same time, you're running a museum, you have children coming through your museum and whatnot, and they're other people's children, they're their values that are in question. And how do you negotiate that territory between sort of a community standard and individual expression in a public space? Now, in a private home, it's a moot point. It's a social contract between whoever provided the artwork and the person who has it in their private home for their own reasons. But the minute that art enters the public space to be shared with as many people as possible, then complications arrive about context and how you put out work and what are your obligations in that regard to negotiating the narrative in a public space. It's not a simple thing to negotiate. You don't want to let the standards of just one individual be sufficient to prohibit art entering a public space. But you don't want to necessarily say, well, most people like it.
It depends who the gatekeepers are, doesn't it? We don't seem to have too much of a problem exhibiting Renaissance nudes. There's loads of female nudes, but nobody has a problem with because they were made in the Renaissance and they're art with a capital A. But if you have something that is considered erotic, why are they not considered erotic? It's it's culture.
Well,
there are children all the time in the National Gallery. No one has an issue with all the female nudes in the National Gallery, but I'm sure if there were a male nude that would be a contemporary male nude, it would automatically generate some kind of nudity notice.
Thank you so much. Escott Hess, thank you so much, Wendy Elia, thank you so much, Marie-Anne Mancio, and it's been an absolutely wonderful conversation. I have to admit that I love these conversations because I enjoy them myself. So I learn a lot speaking to the speakers and listening to other contributions. So thank you to everyone who's been here. It's exciting. I can't say anything other than thank you for being here and for coming back. And there'll be another dialogue on the first of every month.
Thank you, Elina, for doing these things. They've been wonderful. It's great to be here and to be able to speak with artists all over the world.
Thank you very much, Elina, and all the speakers. Really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone who's made comments. Thank you for being here. Thank you. See you next month.